Not too long ago, agencies like the CIA and the FBI hunted this man down from the most obscure islands in the Caribbean to the wilderness of the Colombian jungle. This man combined his entrepreneurial skills with brutal methods to work towards one goal: building a cocaine empire. People called him Crazy Charlie because of his love for both the Beatles and Adolf Hitler. With his innovative and ruthless approach, he helped revolutionize the drug trade and establish the Medellin Cartel as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. He used submarines, planes, and small islands to his advantage, and even built relationships with governments to evade law enforcement. This led to him being responsible for much of the world's cocaine supply in the 1970s and 1980s. In this video, we discuss how Carlos Lehder, aka the cocaine king of the world, became Pablo Escobar's secret weapon in the largest drug operation the world has ever seen. Born on September 7th, 1949, Carlos Lehder grew up in the town of Armenia, a mid-sized city in Colombia. Lehder is of mixed German-Colombian descent. His father, Klaus Wilhelm Lehder, immigrated from Germany in 1928 to build a future in South America. Carlos grew up after the war and had a relatively calm childhood. However, things changed when his parents decided to divorce when he was 15 years old. Carlos' mother, Helena, decided to take him and his brothers to immigrate to the United States. And this is when his life would drastically change. The single-parent family of 5 settled in New York City in 1963, and Carlos' mother was stunned with the amount of opportunity laying around in the US at the time. She wanted her sons to become great businessmen and play an important role in society. However, Carlos already knew a life like that wasn't for him. Before he even graduated high school, Carlos decided to drop out to pursue a career in, let's say, other activities. Carlos began stealing and smuggling cars towards Canada and Colombia. He stole the cars, sold them, and used the profits to buy weed, which he then also sold. A pretty lucrative business model, although I don't think it made his mother any proud. In 1973, however, Carlos was caught by the police smuggling one of the cars towards Colombia. He was arrested and thrown into prison. This could have been the end of the story, but in fact, it is only the beginning. By pure chance, Carlos' cellmate turned out to be somewhat of a partner in crime. In fact, he shared his cell with infamous marijuana smuggler George Young. Young made a name for himself in the 60s and 70s by smuggling marijuana across the border from Mexico. Him and Lehder would spend hours talking about the smuggling business and learn from each other whatever they could. Young and Lehder got along so well that they decided to come up with a plan. They both knew the enormous market for cocaine existed in America, but in the early 70s, the supply of cocaine into the US was scarce. Before the rise of Carlos Lehder, drug trafficking was mostly done through the use of mules. Young women would carry cocaine on airplanes in the hopes of not getting caught. As you can imagine, however, this technique often resulted in failure. Young had experience flying marijuana from Mexico to the US in a small private airplane, flying below the radar and landing on dry lake beds. After their prison release in the mid-70s, Young and Lehder decided to form a partnership with the goal of applying the same technique to traffic cocaine from Colombia to the US. Using a small stolen plane and a professional pilot, the pair began to fly cocaine into the United States via the Bahamas. In the process, they increased their financial resources and built connections and trust with Colombian suppliers, while spreading money around among Bahamian government officials for political and judicial protection. At the height of their operation, US authorities claim that Lehder and Young were responsible for trafficking a total amount of 18 million tons of cocaine. And they did this in only 2 years' time. During his rise as a major drug trafficker, people were often amazed by his personality. They would call him crazy, arrogant, or even wild, but then also said he was intelligent, entrepreneurial, and just generally a good guy. This made him quite the controversial character. Anyway, His renown eventually led to Lehder's introduction to one of the most notorious criminals of all time, Pablo Escobar. Escobar saw him and his operation as the missing link between manufacturing the drugs in Colombia and supplying them to the US. Lehder started making drug runs for Escobar into Florida, and over time, the two became business partners. Together, they were two of the founding fathers of the infamous Medellin Cartel, one of the largest drug operations of all time. In the late 1970s, the partnership between Young and Lehder began to collapse. Young wanted to keep things small and simple, whereas Lehder had his mind set on building his cocaine empire. This led to him buying his own island in the Caribbean, Norman's Key. This island became Lehder's layover between Colombia and the US, as this was a crucial step in his plan. Lehder used cargo planes to bring in massive quantities of cocaine into Norman's Key. These batches were cut up and redistributed into smaller units to be flown to the US by smaller aircrafts. The smaller planes would take off with 15 of them, one after the other. Upon Lehder's first arrival on the island, he introduced himself to the island's inhabitants as Joe Lehder and bought a beachfront house. Soon, however, Carlos started to make his intentions more clear. Lehder brought in his own personal German bodyguards along with a K9 unit of Dobermans. He also bribed the government officials and threatened island inhabitants to make sure no one would rat him out to the US authorities. People were found dead on their yachts, pet dogs were shot, and most neighboring residents forcefully sold their property off to Lehder. One person, however, did not comply with Carlos' rule of tyranny. Professor and marine biologist Richard Novak refused to leave the Norman's Key, and when boatloads of prostitutes arrived on the island and party after party was organized, Novak took action. He made several notifications to the Bahamian police of Lehder's activities, but they only resulted in death threats. However, he didn't stop there. Novak would hide in the bushes and photograph planes and people arriving on the island. The evidence he collected was sent to the DEA, who used this to build this case against Lehder. In mid-1982, the heat from the DEA became too much, and the Medellin Cartel stepped in and ended Carlos' operation on Norman's Key. This will be the end of Lehder's drug trafficking operation. In total, he amassed more than $1 billion through his illegal operation. Upon his return to Colombia, Lehder was forced to hide in the jungle. At the time, Colombia was a divided country, with all war going out between the government, cartels, and paramilitary groups. During his time in the jungle, Lehder co-founded the paramilitary group MAS, with the intention of fighting another paramilitary group, M19, a communist organization that hunted down cartel members. The biggest fear of the cartel bosses was to be extradited to the US, which meant they actually had to spend time in prison. During his career as a drug trafficker, Lehder stated that his motivation for building a cocaine empire wasn't purely financial. He saw drugs like marijuana and cocaine as so-called tools of revolution to bring down US imperialism. Statements like these weren't uncommon for Lehder, who had a very profound political view. Before Carlos Lehder was born, his parents owned a small inn called the Pension Alemana. When the war broke out in 1940, the inn was investigated by American agencies in suspicion of its involvement in Nazi ideology, as the pension was rumored to be a meeting place for Nazis. As it turns out, Father Guillermo Lehder passed these beliefs on to his children. An interviewer once asked Lehder the question, "You have been accused of being a Nazi," to which Lehder responded, "Is that a crime? Not in Colombia." In order to fight the Extradition Treaty, Carlos started his own political party called National Latin Movement. The party's ideals and beliefs were in line with right-wing nationalism, not a very original idea in the 20th century. Ironically, Lehder shared a similar passion to someone else, John Lennon, symbol of peace. He even ordered the construction of a golden statue of John Lennon, wearing a Nazi helmet. Lehder took a step too far in his war with the government. On April 30, 1984, Lehder ordered the assassination of Colombian Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Bonilla. Bonilla was one of the most influential politicians championing an extradition treaty. His killing was a major shock. It soon became clear that Lehder crossed the line. An all-out manhunt started after the assassination, and after a life of running from the authorities, Carlos Lehder was finally brought to justice in 1987. In spite of his efforts to stop an extradition treaty from happening between Colombia and the US, the treaty still came into action. And ironically, Lehder will be the first person to be extradited from Colombia to the US. He was flown over to the United States and tried in an American court. With the Medellin Cartel making threats to the US, Lehder's trial was already a thrilling event. This became even more so when the US Justice Department brought out their crown witness for the case, Lehder's old partner George Young. After getting permission from Pablo Escobar himself, Young testified against his old trafficking buddy, which led to Lehder being sentenced to 150 years in federal prison. However, 2 years into his sentence, things changed. In 1990, the US wanted to bring down Manuel Noriega, former dictator of Panama. Luckily for the US Justice Department, there was one guy in prison who knew Noriega on a personal level. You guessed it, Carlos Lehder. Lehder testified against Noriega and cut his own prison sentence in half by doing so. After having spent only 33 years of the 150 in prison, Lehder was released from US prison in June 2020. At 71 years of age, Lehder was given the permission to get cancer treatment in his beloved Germany. It's not impossible to run into him, as his current whereabouts are rumored to be in Berlin. After having lived a life of extravagance, controversy and crime, Carlos Lehder's days of lawlessness are over. Although he may think back on the countless government officials he bribed, the many lives he ruined, and the billions of dollars he made in the process, Carlos Lehder's imprint on the world will remain for a long time to come.